we go. All right. Good afternoon. My name is Bob Greenbaum. I'm a current intern at the American Academy of Diplomacy. I am also a second-year U.S. Foreign Policy and National Security graduate student at American University's School of International Service. I would like to thank everyone for joining my intern project titled Public Diplomacy in Central America, Democratic Backsliding in Our Backyard. I am very pleased to welcome a broad scope of academic backgrounds, graduate and undergraduate students, private entities, and government officials to this very important discussion. Throughout this panel, our distinguished Academy members in El Salvador will discuss the challenges that U.S. diplomatic missions face in the Northern Triangle, specifically in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Public diplomacy, the United States tool of engagement with foreign publics, is a critical component of U.S. foreign policy making. Enacting policies in Central America continues to be hindered due to the increase of democratic backsliding among these sovereign nations. Moreover, this panel will also discuss themes such as the shrinking civil society, human rights, public relations, economic development, and the issue of gangs and security. Currently, there is a shift in U.S. focus to support our important partners in Latin America. Our panel comprises of former distinguished U.S. ambassadors and a distinguished academic contributor. All have many practical and academic experiences in Latin America. Our moderator for today is Career Ambassador Earl Anthony Wayne. Wayne served as the U.S. Ambassador to Mexico and Argentina. Ambassador Wayne currently serves on the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute Advisory Board and as a senior professional lecturer and distinguished diplomat in residence at the School of International Service. Our first panelist is Dr. Mark L. Schneider. Dr. Schneider is a senior advisor with the Americas Program, the Human Rights Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the Pan-American Development Foundation. Dr. Schneider also served as director of the Peace Corps and assistant administrator of U.S. aid for Latin America and the Caribbean. Our second panelist is Ambassador Liliana Ayalde, an alumni from American University. American Ayalde served as the U.S. Ambassador to Brazil from 2013 to 2016 and Paraguay. Ayalde served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs and Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for Latin American and Caribbean Bureau for USAID. Ambassador Ayalde currently serves as Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Wilson Center's Latin American Program, the National Endowment for Democracy, and the IREX program. Last but not least, our third panelist is Ambassador Luis Arreaga. Arreaga served as the U.S. Ambassador to Guatemala from October 2017 until October 2020. Prior to this appointment, Ambassador Arreaga served as Principal Deputy Secretary of State for the Bureau of International Narcotics from 2013 and 2017. He also served in roles for U.S. aid in El Salvador and Honduras. Now I would like to pass the mic over to the Academy President, Ambassador Ron Newman, to speak about the American Academy of Diplomacy. Ambassador Newman served as Chief of Mission in Afghanistan, Bahrain, and Algeria, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Near East Affairs, and Director of the Office of Northern Gulf Affairs. Ambassador Newman.
Thank you, Bob, and welcome. I'm delighted to see such a large audience. And of course, we'll get to a little larger audience when we post this so others can get a crack at it. Bob referred to it as an intern panel. And I suppose that is correct in terms of its construction, but it is certainly not a novice event in terms of its participants, as you heard in their biographies. Just a brief commercial on the Academy. The American Academy of Diplomacy is now in its 40th year, founded by people like Henry Kissinger and Ellsworth Bunker. George Kennan, for those of you who follow diplomacy, was a founding member. It really has two functions. One is doing reports telling the State Department why we think it could do its job better, and often lobbying the Congress to help the Congress help the State Department do its job better. But the other line of effort, which this is a program is a part, is talking to Americans about what diplomacy is, what it means to work diplomatically, and why it's worth supporting diplomacy. And so, because we're an organization of practitioners, of people who have done the work in the field with foreigners at senior levels over multiple years, I think we often get to a level of detail and discussion which is a little different from other kinds of panels. So that's the Academy in a nutshell. We're very proud of this program of having interns each pick a program. It isn't always a panel, it often is. And it's broadened our outreach in the process of broadening our training. And I think it's left an experience that most of our participants have enjoyed. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ambassador Wayne to run the panel.
All right. Thank you, Ron. Thanks, Bob. We're always still learning, so we're always interns in that sense, right? It's a great pleasure to be with you all this afternoon and to look at Central America from the point of view of public diplomacy. That means looking at it through the lens of trying to deliver US messages to influence the citizens and officials of other governments on key issues that are often really hard to work from a substantive point of view, but are important to address in a way that can be understood and shared with the local populations. That means embassies and the State Department have to try to understand what the key audiences are, what they care about, how they get their news, how they listen to opinions, and then figure out if they can deliver those, evaluate if they're delivering them, and then adjust to look for better ways to do that. And that's especially important with some of the key issues we're going to talk about today. The status of democracy, migration, and the tendencies of people to leave these three countries in the northern part of Central America to try to head to the United States. Looking at the importance of building up prosperity locally and strengthening civil society locally, and dealing with the threats of public security and gangs. So fortunately, as you've heard, we have a really stellar group of colleagues to talk about that. So maybe I suggest we first start talking about what's been called democratic backsliding and how the United States and the embassies in the region can best address some of these democracy issues through the use of public diplomacy. So why don't we, let's start out. Mark, would you like to say a few things first, and then Liliana, and then Luis, please?
Sure. I think that the first thing to recognize is that in our region, that is the Economist Democracy Index, Latino Barometro, they've all seen since the start of the 21st century, a very significant decline in democracy in this hemisphere. In fact, the region was cited as the one region of the world where the greatest decline has occurred. And therefore, it seems to me that we need to think about whether we're using all of the tools at our disposal. Former Defense Secretary Gates, in an op-ed not too long ago, basically said that we're not. And I think that he's correct. But I think that one of the important things is that we need to be consistent in our actions and in our statements with respect to what the priorities are of our foreign policy. And as you said, Tony, we need to convey that not just to governments, but to the civil society and the populations in those countries. And so I think that if we really believe, as the Biden administration has declared in the root causes strategy that supporting democracy, human rights, anti-corruption, and inclusive development in the three countries that we're talking about, both for their own importance of those issues and because they can help constrain migration, then we have to be consistent in conveying that message. And it's not clear that we are. And I think that's one of the tasks before us, is to figure out how we can use the kind of modern digitized social media world more effectively to convey that these are our priorities. Here are the policies that we've undertaken to pursue those priorities. And if you move in the other direction, there are consequences. I don't think we explained ahead of time very clearly what the conditions are that would result in sanctions. And we also, I don't think, have acted in a way to say, this is, by the way, the kinds of actions that will result in sanctions being removed. I think that there's a lot that needs to be done there. And we need to do it not just ourselves, but with civil society here and there, media, other public opinion leaders.
Thank you, Mark. Liliana.
Yes, well, good afternoon to everyone. I want to recognize there are I saw there are two other ambassadors in this joining us, Frank and Jim, who also know a lot about the region. So I'll just add to what Mark has said. By thinking about public diplomacy today, I mean, I first served in Central America, Guatemala and Nicaragua in the late 80s and 90s, and we had similar issues then. Today, they've gotten even more complex. You know, we've got the overlay of criminal organizations, cross borders. You know, we used to be focused more on the country specific. Now it's across borders. There are no limits, you know, to corruption, illicit activities, and everything that we have to do is superimposed on the issues related to economic growth, lack of economic growth, democracy, building, and so forth. So so that makes it even more urgent that we have a public diplomacy strategy that is alive. So it has to be constantly evolving. And I would say, if I may just throw out there some considerations in thinking about this, one is that it's got to be broad-based. You know, we've got to talk about this whole of society approach to it. You know, we can't only see, okay, this is what the embassy is thinking we should be doing, and that is not easy to do, because we're talking about engaging private sector, academia, and, you know, unifying a strategy of messages and tools and mechanisms is complicated, takes time, but you need it because you need to approach different audiences. So having this unified, broad-based strategy, I think it's complicated, but it needs to be done with short-term, medium-term, and long-term efforts, and recognizing that the region is not monolithic. I am one who is constantly disturbed with the term of the Northern Triangle, because it's a term we came up with. And, you know, the Central Americans, they're very different. Guatemala is very different from Honduras, very different from El Salvador. So when we structure a public diplomacy strategy, it's got to be really tailored to different audiences, to different realities, different cultural idiosyncrasies. And, you know, complicated, takes time, but it needs to be done. It's this tailored approach is obviously necessary. And in doing so, involving the local experts, you know, whether it's calling in civil society, trying to build that up, and engaging with the various actors that really know what makes the difference, and taking into account lessons learned of what has worked and what has not worked and why it hasn't worked, and build on that over time to get a better strategy. I had an opportunity to work with the with the military, and they did a lot on anticipating scenarios. And I think that's very important to, although you can't anticipate them in Central America, because there's always new issues coming up. But, at least thinking through these is obviously helpful in trying to structure or design a strategy that would work in today's environment, which is very complicated. I'll just wrap it there.
Thank you. Luis, please.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And it's always tough to come after two brilliant exponents of our policy. So what can you say that is different without disagreeing with them, which of course I do not disagree with them. But I think one of the messages, I agree with everything, but one of the things we have to be careful about when we communicate, particularly our policies, particularly the tools that we are ready to use, whether sanctions or whatever else, that we do not convey the sense that somehow we are going to fix the problems of these countries. We should present ourselves as a willing partner, but really the solutions have to be organic, and we should be make it clear that we're not there to solve their problems. We're not there to bring down governments, God forbid, or to do any crazy thing. I mean, we believe in certain principles. We're willing to take actions consistent with those principles, but ultimately, whatever happens in the country will be in the hands of civil society, the private sector, and others. So it's striking that balance where we can make a difference in many different ways, but we are not going to be the ones who actually drive the train or are going to deliver something that is much bigger than that we're capable of delivering.
Thank you, Luis. I think that all of you made excellent points, and that's exactly right. So let's consider for a minute two of the issues that we do message about and we care about: migration and economic development. In a sense, how do we think about the kind of messages that might encourage some people not to migrate? How can you influence that? How do you encourage some of the messages that might be supportive of investment and economic development and other things? It's not always easy to do that. I agree very much that we have to understand who we're speaking to. That means we have to identify the different audiences. And as we know, different audiences in different countries respond to different kind of messaging. And then we have to understand how they are hearing our messages too. We need to know what kind of social media they look at in different countries. There are different kinds of social media that people listen to. We have to have some sort of an ability to poll people, as well as having, as Liliana correctly said, having civil society leaders and others come in and talk to them. We should also have a means of understanding if our messages are being heard, if they're having effect, and then respond to that. So just thinking about these two kind of messages, are there any kind of messages that have really had effect, do you think, on the tendency to migrate? And are there kind of messages that actually can be encouraging of economic development, encouraging of inward investment, of job creation? Anybody who would like to go first, start off.
Can we start the same way? I'll try.
Okay.
What's important is to understand that it's simply not economic growth. That what's key, as you said, is economic development that incorporates the vulnerable groups in the population. If you look at where migration comes from, especially if you look at the highlands in Guatemala, if all of our investment is not going significantly into those areas, then we're losing an opportunity to affect the decision of people to leave. There's sort of two things. I think actually in something that I wrote, I quoted Samantha Power. She said, we really have to focus not just on fair and free elections, which is crucial and important. And there's a major issue right now coming up in Guatemala as to whether we're going to see fair and free elections. But she's also said to address the indignity of corruption, inequality, and the lack of economic opportunity. And I think that we need to think about it in two ways, both positively and negatively. That is, to convey clearly into those communities that we're prepared to support the efforts to increase jobs, to increase economic opportunities, to increase their access to schools, in education and health in those areas. And that we're going to press their governments to cooperate and do that, which particularly in Guatemala just simply has not occurred, partly because the government has declined to provide sufficient tax revenues over the course of decades. And so I think that there is a need there to do more. And the other thing that I would say, as when they look at the studies, economic opportunity is fundamental, but so too is reducing their fear from gangs and cartels in terms of extortion, particularly in those communities. Extortion has been one of the most significant sort of issues that communities fear. I think the estimates were that several $billions have been lost as a result of extortion. So I think that we can focus on some of these issues in a way to affect migration, and also it's key to do that. We have to do something about economic development.
And how do we, for our other colleagues, just invite you to say, so how do we use the messaging to have impact on people, showing that we care about these issues? Because we have USAID programs, we have programs from INL, which is part of the State Department working on law enforcement and security. How do we use public diplomacy to reinforce the impact these other programs may be having directly on the ground?
So, so I think I'm next. We have to keep in mind that all these issues, and let's take the reasons for migration. And if you dig into a little bit, yes, it is, principally economically driven, but also security. And so it's multi-pronged. And so it's not only about us using our different agencies to work on these issues from different perspectives, but as Luis well said, it's the ownership of the country also kind of joining in, or driven by them. It's not we're joining them. But also I think there's an underestimation of how complex this is, and how we're changing people's attitudes, practices, and it takes time. If we look at certain areas where there has probably been a very well-articulated set of support, there have been changes, and you can measure it. Where there's security, whether the youth are being trained and they get economic opportunities in those areas. And I know Guatemala had some, I'd seen some in Honduras, in those areas where that you have that well-articulated, well-tailored approach, multi-pronged engagement from the private sector. It works, but it's over time. And then recognize that sometimes we can't combat certain, some people are always going to migrate because they, it's like fighting those that grow, trafficked coca, and you can provide other crops, but at the end of the day, they're going to want to keep on doing it. So how can you work on trying to better prepare the youth, strengthen the organization so they can be more transparent, and so it's working all these different levers together with a strong public diplomacy strategy that is constantly evolving and checking to make sure that we're doing the right thing, saying the right messages, and it's a strategy that is alive and constantly being reviewed.
All right. I would like to go back to the very beginning and suggest that we in the US should be honest with ourselves and have a real conversation about migration, both the good and the bad. But we're not doing that. And the reason we are not is because the issue has become so hyper-politicized that you have the administration being forced to make unreasonable promises about addressing migration when migration has been so demonized that the objective is to stop migration when we need to really understand what the process means, both here and in the countries of the region. And I think Liliana touched on some very good points. I mean, if you go to the Western Highlands in Guatemala, you quickly realize that these are now binational areas where American culture is deeply embedded into these places where you go to cemeteries and you find all these, mausoleums with American flags. You find these huge homes of migrants with the American flag and the Guatemalan flag, and you have this process going for, I would say, generations. You're not going to stop it. I think that's something that it's a given. At this date, that's not going to stop. But if we don't recognize it and we don't see it for what it is, we're going to keep looking at the wrong solutions. I'm not saying that what we're doing is wrong, but I think the focus, and we have to look at it from a different perspective, to have a more reasonable expectation about what it can achieve and over what period of time in reducing migration. So I think those are some key issues that we need to look at, and we need to be honest with ourselves, and we need to be honest with the analysis that we're using, because we're afraid of revealing that the forces of migrations are so strong that there is very little we can do to stop them in the short term. The longer term is a different story, but nobody wants to hear that, because if resources are invested, they want results today, even though the resources approved today will not be in the field for 2 years. But we play this game that we think we have the answers and that we're going to deliver results that we deep down inside know are not going to happen.
Yeah, Luis, you're exactly right. We don't have the answers to many of these questions. And politics in the United States certainly have a big impact on what's possible. So given that, what are the ways that by which we can build a relationship or a connection with the local populations? And this becomes very important, especially when there might be a trend of democratic backsliding. People may be undermining civil society organizations, democratic practices. We have what some have labeled a spin dictator in El Salvador, who is dominating the media. So what are some of the ways we should think through the use of public diplomacy to build different connections for the longer run, that we might not get immediate results, but we're trying to deliver messages that will have a medium and longer term impact, and maybe some short term ones too, to help some civil society organizations?
Should we go again? All right.
Yeah, sure.
One thing that I just saw, that there's a group called Faith, I believe it's Faith Organizations in Action, that just put out an assessment of the root causes strategy. It's about 200 civil society organizations from around those 3 countries, and to some here as well. And what they were arguing is that the kind of sustainable, locally led development that's key is something that it's the right message, but we have to back it up. So that means that much more of our aid needs to go through local organizations and figure out how we can get those local organizations to be able to manage the money. It's very hard for them to meet all of the requirements in terms of auditing and et cetera. We need to figure out better ways to do that in order to expand their ownership of these kinds of programs. And the second is, let's face it, as you sort of hinted, Tony, there are some parts of the elite power structure in each of the countries that is really not enamored of our government's focus on democracy, rule of law, anti-corruption, and democratic change. And over the course of the last couple of years, they've been better at blocking those kinds of actions than we have in helping civil society and others, democratic leaders in those countries, move forward. And we need to think that through. Let me just give you one fact that this local organization came up with. Everybody says, well, the whole US policy is based on sanctions. Not true. But when we the numbers are the following. Between 2021 and 2023, we, as a result of the Engel list and others, we applied 78 sanctions, visa sanctions on individuals in Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. But you know how many that affected their finances? 6. So we really didn't deal very much in terms of impacting directly some of those individuals who have been key in going after those good judges and good prosecutors in Guatemala and in El Salvador. I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark.
So what I would add to that is, when I think of what, where should I invest? And given the scenario that we find today with so many of these challenges, I would focus on the youth and helping them become more competitive, and so that they have the skills and generate the competitive environment to attract small business, or so that they have a better future at the end of the day, if that environment, whether it's in the highlands, with better agricultural practices among the young farmers, small farmers, or the small businesses in the smaller cities. I think that is, it's longer term, but that's the way to go, at the same time as working on some of the governance issues to be able to protect that civic space. But again, we need, it takes 2 to tango, and this is really led by the countries, and certainly with development assistance, we don't do it on our own. We've got to work with someone.
Luis?
Well, I'd like to take up on Mark's point that yes, we need to work with the local institutions, credit unions, and a number of the local cooperatives, and it is possible to do it, but we shouldn't think of it as something that only the U.S. government can do. There are plenty of private sector enterprises. There's some young CEOs, particularly in Guatemala, who are looking at their role with very different eyes and are trying to find ways on how their enterprises can be helpful to the country, how the wealth they generate can be shared with communities, not as something that you as charity, but as providing opportunities for the communities to prosper. There's this nascent movement, certainly in Guatemala, and I suspect it also in other countries, and that's something that we as the U.S. government, or those who are still in the U.S. government, can do to try to encourage them, because after all, they have a lot more resources than the U.S. government can bring to bear. So I would suggest that this would be one of the ways we can do this.
No, I think you're right, Luis. So let me suggest from what you have all said that really the public diplomacy effort, its strategy and campaign, should be focused on these kind of activities where we are working with partners and helping in economic development, in fighting gangs, in keeping CSO, civil society organizations going, with the ambassador going and being seen with them, being seen with young people who are getting attention, graduating, starting new businesses. And we should have our social media reinforcing this sort of positive example of the ties that, as Luis said, are so strong between each of these countries and the United States, also in various ways. And this should be a big part of this public diplomacy, is getting out these positive messages about what's going on, and then suddenly mixing in the message, there's more to do here. Let's work together and do this. Is that how we should design this strategy to be more effectively? Other ideas? Why, build on top of that, please.
I think that makes a lot of sense, Tony. I mean, I think that we have to think both in the short and long term. you know, they talk about the global fragility framework over a 10-year period. That's a good planning basis. But right now, there are communities in the highlands of Guatemala that are hurting. And we need to figure out how we can do a better job at communicating that our development assistance, that the Partnership for Central America, the call to action, et cetera, is in the short run going to have an impact on those communities in a positive way. And we need to do it, it seems to me, by doing a better job on what public diplomacy in the sense of engaging with the local communities, local civil society organizations, and explaining what we're attempting to do and why, and then getting their feedback and their comments and their ideas. I mean, there are civil society organizations throughout these three countries at the national, local, and departmental level. We need to be sure that they feel, and I don't think they do yet, they feel that they have input into our decisions about how we're attempting to work with them.
Very good.
So what I would add to that, and I 100% agree that there's a lot of thinking going on and contributions that can be made by those who are the experts and know the issues, know the best way to get to the messages across and not necessarily resolve them overnight. But I think we're also underestimating the complexity of these issues, that these are multi-generational. You know, it's not going to be resolved. We think, you know, there's a project and at the end of the project, things are going to be improved. No, we build on it over time and somehow, you know, we stop it and then we turn it on and turn it off. It's just not a way to work it. And when you're talking about development, it's short term, medium term, and long term. And politically, we just don't have the patience to, and we have these expectations that things are going to change. And if they don't change in 2 years and we don't have the results, then let's turn that off. Let's do something else. When, you know, if you train youth, or if you strengthen institutions, if you fight corruption, it is a long-term effort. And, you know, we need partners of all sorts coming together. It's like smoking here, you know, and in our own country was generations. And it involves different media and different mechanisms and constantly evolving, because today's technology is different today and tomorrow, and it's just hyperactive. And so we need experts that really can be ahead of it and have some way of constantly be looking at that, but with our focus on some of these more long-term development challenges that we have.
Luis, and do you want to say anything about any particular programs you saw in the anti-gang public security area or anything? Because I know you were very present and active in the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement also.
Right. I mean, I don't want to diminish the impact of gangs on the migration issue, but in some areas where we have a lot of migrants coming from, in Guatemala, there are no gangs. So it's more of a, I would say it's more of an urban issue than an issue out in the highlands. But nonetheless, it's a big problem. And the US government has been working on this for many, many years. In fact, back in 2016, I believe, the State Department, INL, and USAID joined forces in establishing this place-based strategy to deal with the gang problems. And it's one of the more successful programs out there because it is a comprehensive approach that involves community policing, that involves NGOs, that involves civil society, that involves heads of household, the church, in providing a combination of smart policing along with services and making areas safe for youth to be in. And that's something that continues. And that's what we should be working on. So there are ways to deal with it. I don't know El Salvador, so I couldn't tell you what the issue is there. I know we had programs like that in El Salvador. I visited them and they made sense then, but that was a few years ago. Now the situation has changed. But in any event, we have the tools, we've had the experience, we've been working on it for good. Unfortunately, because of the backsliding on democracy. Some of the police departments have become less trustworthy, I would say. But there are units, there are special units that were created, trained, technology that was shared with the police forces to learn how to do community policing. There's lots out there that should be preserved, and I think that's probably what we should be doing now, preserving the institutions and the trainees so they can be ready when better times come around, and they will. But yes, that's my experience with gangs. Yeah.
Could I follow up on that?
Please.
Luis is absolutely right. Also in Salvador, from about 2000, remember we had the boost in migration in 2014 of unaccompanied minors. Salvador, USAID and the State Department worked on this place-based public security program in 50 of the highest homicide municipalities. And there was a very significant reduction. The reduction in homicide rate in Salvador actually began well before Bukele took office. And it took down from about 100 per 100,000 down to around 30 something. And that without violating due process, without simply arbitrary detentions. And by the way, at this point, they've just passed legislation that permits the detention without charge for as long as they want. It also permits the government to sentence 12 to 15-year-olds to up to 10 years in jail, and 16-year-olds up to 20 years in jail. I mean, the violation of due process in Salvador during the current estado de excepción is enormous. And while in the short term, there's no question that it has reduced homicides and extortion, in the long term, it is a disaster for the rule of law in that country.
Yeah, Mark, sadly, I think you're correct. So one of the challenges, as Liliana correctly pointed out, and as Luis and Mark, you pointed out, is we did have a number of programs that were working in Central America. We then slowed or eliminated many of those programs in recent years, and now we've ramped them back up again. And it does take a long time to change society, which I think, again, going back to the core of this discussion, looking at public diplomacy, is you need an overarching public diplomacy effort that keeps moving, developing these themes, even as Liliana correctly said, you're tactically adjusting on a regular basis, responding to what's happening in public opinion. But you have to embrace all of our programs and our themes and keep working on these and building these partnerships. And that means we need an integrated strategy, much more sophisticated than we have been able to sustain in most places, many places, up until this point. Anybody have any thoughts on where you might have seen a good public diplomacy strategy take root and work and continue, and what might be some of the best practices that you've observed for reinforcing these efforts?
That's a challenge, but
eloquent.
may I offer maybe one idea that not fully cooked, but if we look at Plan Colombia, just from the public diplomacy perspective, it was a multi-partisan supported program, and so, I mean, there are ingredients, I mean, with all the criticisms that it may have, because I know there are folks that will take issue on certain aspects of it, but as a bipartisan strategy, it worked for a long time. It's worked for a long time. And so, but, we had it from the top, congressional, we've got, both sides of the aisle. It was academia, it was the private sector, and it was a long time, consistent view on this. So, and I go back to the place-based programs, that those were good programs. but they were small. And the idea originally was, as if I recall correctly, they were like almost pilots. Let's see if it works, and then scale up. And the scaling up is where we meet the problems, because we've got to go all the way up to congressional audiences. And so anyway, it made me think of Plan Colombia, just because that's a term that a lot of people know, and it kind of had its impact as a public diplomacy strategy that evolved over time, but it was consistent over 20-some years. And here we had something that was going to work, with place-based strategy. And, it's been lost in the rigmarole of politics and domestic politics and so forth. So anyway, just some thoughts out there to munch on.
Another ingredient of Plan Colombia was that there was consensus in Colombia itself, where the private sector was willing to pony up a significant amount of money. The Colombian government was willing to spill quite a bit of its own blood fighting, fighting the guerrillas. I mean, there was consensus that remained over several administrations, and that's one ingredient that is going to be hard to find in the countries of the region. At least I know in Guatemala and possibly in Honduras as well. Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the key aspects is what Liliana mentioned, is that you had over 3 administrations, at least, you had full support for U.S. engagement at every level in terms of trying to pursue development and peace in Colombia. And I should add, obviously, there was also the effort to reduce coca cultivation and trafficking. But at the end, what was important as well was that we supported Colombians' decision to pursue a peace agreement, even though there were many, I suspect, in the United States, some parties who were not very, let's say, enthusiastic about that. But we kept together in terms of supporting Colombia on that effort. And I think that's important. And we kept it up for more than a decade.
So part of what we're saying is that public education, public outreach is important in the United States as well as overseas to maintain a consistency in approach as you're going forward. Well, those place-based strategies actually started in the United States. They were based on the best practices from anti-gang programs across the United States. Then they were adapted by USAID and INL to apply in Central America. And they indeed were working, but we didn't have that consistent support. And it was, at moments, we did have that united team effort that we had for a long time in Colombia, but it did not last in Central America or in Mexico. Same thing, same challenges in Mexico and other places. So maybe we'd be happy to open it up now for any questions that people would like to submit from the audience. I think, Bob, are you going to monitor the screen of people who might raise their hands? I can't see the whole screen from here. Or Katie, one of you want to recognize people and offer questions?
Yes, definitely. We'd definitely love some questions from the audience. So the first hand I do see is Roger Rolando Reyes. And see if.
Hi, good afternoon. Buenas tardes. Some of the ambassadors, I think Ambassador Arreaga and similar to Ambassador Ayalde, both of you mentioned immediacy as one of the things, one of the tactics that we have to consider in looking at the Central America strategy. How do you use public diplomacy to combat the narrative that, for example, Bukele is bringing around a lot of stability, whereas the common practices that we have seen in the past used by the US government have not yielded as such a quick result as what Bukele is doing now?
There we go. That was an easy question to start off with there. Good question, Roger.
Well, I mean, I think you have to be honest about what it has been successful and what has not. And I think you have to be willing, and this is something where I'm not sure that we are, is for the US to be clearly willing to go publicly in El Salvador, talk to the civil society organizations, talk to the independent press member. El Fado just had to leave the country because they were threatened by the government, the independent journalists. And he needs to say, there have been a significant number, over 100 people killed in those jails. There have been reports that the UN and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights have stated involve torture. So we need to be saying there are some things about it that clearly should not be supported and should not continue. And I think we need to say, for the benefit of the country, that due process and the rule of law still are crucial for everything that people in El Salvador want. They want investment, they want economic development, and they want, I think, most of the people still would like to see free and fair elections. And you need the rule of law to make that happen.
Luis, Liliana, you want anything?
No, no.
Oh, okay, next question, please.
All right, so the next question, the next hand we do have is Eric. And you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you so much, Bob. Also, thank you for your interventions and great discussion over here. So, my name is Eric Moher, and I'm currently pursuing a Master's of Science in Diplomacy and International Security at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. I have two questions. The first question is, what role did the Office of Public Diplomacy for Latin America and the Caribbean play in shaping public opinion and influencing policy during the Reagan administration? And how did it differ from other public diplomacy efforts? My second question is, how does the US leverage its soft power and cultural assets to promote its image and interest in Latin America? And what are some of the examples? Thank you.
I didn't quite get the first question, but I do have the second one. So why don't we start on that?
I can start with the second one because I didn't hear the first one very well either. But yeah, I think we underestimate the power of the people-to-people engagements that we, as the United States, have, and the power in actually improving people's lives, whether through educational exchanges or the Fulbright scholarship programs, or, there's just a number of different US programs that invests in people. I mean, I think back on Guatemala, when I served there, we structured some programs about getting the indigenous to go to the universities. And now I see that those are graduates, and they have high profile leadership positions. Not that enough has been done, but investing in those programs is something that the U.S. government should feel very proud of. The problem is sometimes the resources aren't enough, but there's something to be said about those investments that could add to a positive public diplomacy. We're not good about talking about what we do. And I say we, I'm now retired, but there's a reluctance. We don't do it as well as other people talk about themselves, particularly in this day and age where, we compete with China. At the end of the day, if you have a Chinese, a scholarship going to China or a scholarship going to the United States, a Central America will probably prefer going to the United States than China. But we don't talk enough about it. So I think there are real opportunities there to further talk about what it is that we're doing.
Well, I might just add that one of the things that, in addition to the exchanges and both short-term and long-term, which are very powerful, there, as Eric correctly pointed out, there is a great admiration for a lot of the soft power of the United States in films and music and other things. And when we create dialogues by having some of those artists come and talk to people and exchange, it makes people in other countries realize they share something with the United States, and they can start talking about other more difficult issues. And I've certainly found that in all of my postings. When I went to Argentina as ambassador, it had the highest ratings of anti-Americanism in the hemisphere at that point. And what helped break through that was really music, and the fact that Argentines and Americans love similar music, and they could dialogue about that. And that just opened up doors for different kinds of conversations about some of the more difficult issues, including freedom of the press, including supporting civil society organizations that were doing good things. So you can open a lot of doors with soft power, and thus public diplomacy that lets you get into some of the tougher issues. So I think that's right.
If I may just add, just very quickly, because I was in Brazil during the World Cup and the Olympics, we used sports to talk about, bringing some of the athletes that and eventually got into some very difficult issues as race and so forth. But being creative and using those mega events as a way of talking about these issues. So yes, very much so.
Luis.
One of the areas that I think we have not explored because it doesn't come naturally to the State Department is working with the migrant communities in the United States. They are enormous. Many of them are pretty well off. They remain very engaged with their home countries via transfers, via remittances. And in many cases, they are organized and they want to help. But how does the State Department go around and reach out to a domestic community in the United States? It's not something that is in the DNA of the State Department, but something that probably should be looked at because they can be very influential in their own countries via various ways. The fact is we don't really understand it how it works, but I've seen enough of it to know that it's there and it can be helpful.
Yeah, I agree very much, Luis. I remember visiting communities in Mexico that had large segments of those communities in the United States, and people loved it. And they had very nice conversations, and we saw where the money that had been sent back had been used locally. And it establishes a connectivity that we might not otherwise have.
Particularly some of the communities in Central America the diaspora seem to gravitate to certain areas like the Salvadorians or in and around Washington, the Honduras and Louisiana and so forth. So it's I don't know where the Guatemalans necessarily gravitate to, but I know there's lots in Florida. But that might be a way to engage those diaspora.
I also think that we need to engage more the returned Peace Corps volunteers, retired ambassadors who served in those countries, to reach out to some of those communities in the U.S. and engage with them, and to how together you might be able to connect to the communities in the countries in the region.
Yes, good point. Maybe one more question, Bob, you want to ask?
All right. So we do have one, and he's a former ambassador to Honduras, Ambassador Cregan. I believe you did. Would you like to ask a question? Oh, I think you're on mute.
There you go.
When we were talking about remittances, I was thinking of the impact remittances had. This brings back my European experience in Portugal. They had worked in France and also in Italy, working in the automobile industries of Germany, and then bringing back the remittances and changing communities. And so that's very powerful. But what I had to ask was, or tell, or both. So when I went out as ambassador to Honduras, I had a letter from President Clinton with kind of generalized instructions. And one of the most important was, if you want to have a good relationship with the United States, then you need to develop democracy. You need to improve the democracy, because that's really the crux of things. I wonder if ambassadors have letters today going out or not, but I was struck. So, and I think Mark was, and by the way, it's great to see Mark. I haven't seen him since the 1990s. Terrific, good. But I was struck the other day. I'm a professor now, and I met with a group of the State Department international visitors, those who will probably have good positions back home. I walked into meet with a group. 20 of them are right around a table, journalists and others, and me. And I said, what is most important? I mean, democracy, and I had to say, or security. To a person, it was security, whether they were from Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua. Well, Nicaragua was a different problem. But I don't know what we do about that, because security and then development can take place to the detriment of what Mark was talking about, of course, with all the democratic impulses.
All right, who would like to respond to Jim?
Security or development of democracy? Human rights, what about human rights?
All of the above.
But all these people from Central America said security.
Yeah, but
I don't doubt that, but the reality is you're not going to get security for over a long period of time unless you have the rule of law and an effective justice system. You simply can't. The mano dura policy is not a long-term policy. And you have to establish the institutions, the rule of law in an effective way. And that's something that I think that we can do a better job of communicating how important that is. And again, as has been said here, and Liliana and Luis and Tony, not just by our diplomats, but by others as well. And with the civil society organizations in those countries and the democratic spokesmen in those countries.
I think that's right. And that's a good message to end on, that we need an integrated set of messages that talk about security, prosperity, and freedom, democracy, in an effective way, as we mentioned earlier, consistently over a long period of time, and follow that message up with actions, link it with actions on the ground. Thank you all very, very much for being with us today. Bob, do you want to wrap up?
Yes, definitely. I really do appreciate everyone coming, and I hope you got something from this conversation that you can take with you and talk to other people about and spread the word about public diplomacy in Central America. I will also like to express my appreciation to our moderator, our panelists, Academy staff, Katie, Maria, and Ambassador Newman, who's on this call, for supporting me through this process and making it a reality. A huge thank you to those who also joined today in the audience. Without each and every one of you, we would not have the full experience. Please definitely spread the word again, and share that we will have a panel recording. So just be on the lookout for that, so you can share with your friends, family, and colleagues. So yes, and send it to those who would like to know more about the work of our diplomats, our experts, contributors who are in the U.S. Foreign Service. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.